Georgia Department of Transportation is building a replacement bridge here in Burke County over Brier Creek. And there's an archaeological site that was identified first in 2017 when we came out to do what's called Phase 1 archaeology survey. And we identified the site, and through Phase 2 testing, we determined it was significant. And now we're out here for a Phase 3 data recovery because a portion of the site could not be avoided.
We are trying to get as much information from the part of the site that will be affected by the project as possible. So essentially doing data recovery, preserving all of that information for the future.
This site, 9BK531, is a pre-contact site. That means, prior to European settlement in the U.S. We call it pre-contact in Georgia. We think it's a lithic quarry or workshop, which refers to making tools out of stone. So this would have been a place folks were gathering resources like lithic material, stones, to make tools, and doing some of the work to make the tools here. The bridges along this road behind us need to be replaced for safety reasons. And for all GDOT projects, there are environmental surveys that occur ahead of time. That includes for ecology, they look at wetlands and endangered species, and we also look for cultural resources like historic homes and plantations or archaeological sites. And so it was during an archaeological survey that they noticed a lot of artifacts coming out of this particular area. And so we did some further excavations and investigations and determined that the site was of significance and potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places.
The bridge that's here now dates back to the 60s, and that was before the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act. There was no federally mandated process for identifying and preserving cultural resources, including archaeological sites.
Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is the main law that we're following here today. It requires that we consider cultural resources in development projects that are associated with federal funding. It requires that we find out what cultural resources are there. It requires that we consult with the tribal representatives that would be interested in the area, and that we also reach out to other community members who might be interested, historical societies or other descendant communities that might have an interest in an area. It's really just to ensure that, that we're not losing our history while we're doing, what is often necessary work for people's everyday safety. With the number of projects that we have going on across the state, we use a lot of environmental consultant groups like Edwards Pittman to do the field work for us, and then we review the reporting and we coordinate and consult along the way to make sure that they're following the methodologies that we've established and the arrangements that we've set up with different agency reviewers. We really do rely heavily on these environmental consultants to go out and do the digging and all the record keeping, and then consolidate that for us into a report, and then we, use the end product as, what guides our decision making, and also, as part of our mitigation efforts when those are necessary.
The first thing we do at a site like this, when we're going to do excavations like this, is establish a site grid. We pick a datum, and that's like our origin in a Cartesian plane, and then we have a direction that's north and a direction that's east from that datum, and then everything on the site can be recorded in terms of its location relative to that datum. So you keep precise information on location of artifacts and where they're coming from. And so archaeologists like to be very rigorous in how we sample a site. We want to know precisely where it came from within our grid horizontally and at what depth it came from. We also use a vertical datum that will measure the depth below that datum as we dig down.
We dig in 10-centimeter levels. We dig very carefully with shovels. We use flat shovels that we sharpen to get through the roots initially. and then we dig flat. Once we dig the dirt out of the units, we'll put it in buckets and we take it over to the shaker screens and we'll shake it through hardwire mesh and we'll pick out the artifacts and bag them. All of those bags will have the provenience information of where it came from. And in this particular case, we are quartering each level. So we've got 4 different bags per level so we can get a finer idea of the density within each unit.
We decided for this project it's more important than ever to keep very precise, high resolution control on where the artifacts are coming from. We knew going into it that we'd have preservation issues in terms of the acidic, sandy soil. It percolates water such that organic materials are not likely to be well preserved. We're probably not going to find organic stains associated with posts and pits, features that you might find on other archaeological sites. At this site, we're expecting the features to be more clusters of durable material. The cores and hammerstones that they use to make bifaces might be found arranged in such a way that the artifacts themselves and their arrangement comprises a feature. If a site looks like it might be impacted by the proposed project and a site is potentially significant, we need to know that early in the process so that the correct steps can be taken to either avoid or mitigate. Shovel tests are our initial sampling strategy, wherein we'll just excavate across a landform at approximately 100-foot intervals, and every 100-foot we'll stop and we'll dig a small hole about 1 foot wide and several feet deep, and we'll screen the dirt that was excavated out of that hole to look for artifacts. And the screen is just hardware mesh in a frame, and we find artifacts, then we know we're on a site. And then we can shorten our interval of testing to delineate the site and find the boundaries and the edges of the site.
Phase 2 is a little bit more intensive than the phase 1, so usually it involves units, test units. It's a square hole, essentially, that's a little bit larger. Down here with sands that go pretty deep, it's 1 by 2 meters in size, and we've been going down at least 1 meter. It's testing multiple areas within that site boundary to see if we find any variations with artifact density, if like one area might be a hot spot for maybe habitation, if somebody was living at this spot, and then having like a tool or workshop somewhere else where there's a lot of like lithic debris in another spot.
If we follow those first steps, phase 1 and phase 2, and we identify a site and it is significant, then that's when GDOT gets with its tribal partners, with the State Historic Preservation Office, and develops a mitigation plan on how to address the impact to the significant site. This is a phase 3 data recovery. It's one part of the agreement between the agency and the State Historic Preservation Office and the Tribal Historic Preservation Office to mitigate the adverse effects of the site. We based our data recovery plan off the information we acquired in the phase 1 and the phase 2. We knew roughly how artifacts were distributed across the landform, but we weren't precisely sure on the integrity at given locations across the landforms. When this road was initially built in the 60s, they created what's called a burrow pit, where they excavated a lot of embankment fill to raise the level of the road to match that of the bridge grade. We discovered during terrain analysis that there was a tiny lip of a terrace on the north side of the road between the road embankment and the burrow pit that we thought perhaps might be a piece of the original landform and therefore could still have archaeological integrity. And so one of our first steps was to explore that. North of the road wasn't conducive to additional investigations, so we moved all of our effort to this south side of the road. The 30s and 40s is when archaeologists across the country were first realizing the antiquity of large spear points called Clovis points that are a classic lancelet shaped spear point with a fluted bottom. And these were initially identified in Clovis, New Mexico, and discovered to be associated with ancient mastodon bones. That information was still novel in the 30s and 40s when archaeologists in Georgia were just starting to realize that surface collections made by amateur archaeologists had already found these points, and we just didn't know how old they were. There was a preacher in Rennes, Georgia, who had collected from Brier Creek a cache of Clovis points from some undisclosed location, but that was the first whiff that professional archaeologists got that the Brier Creek region was a place where you were likely to encounter archaeological remains of Clovis culture. In the early 60s, there was a man by the name of Sergeant Tero, who was an officer at Fort Gordon up in Augusta, and he was an amateur and just enjoyed collecting artifacts, and he found a site here on Brier Creek that thereafter was named the Tero site. From all this previous archaeological research in the area, we knew the Brier Creek region was prone to having lithic deposits specifically, lithics being the rocks that were used to make stone tools. So the Brier Creek region is readily known for archaeological sites dating to archaic woodland period, even rarer but significantly Paleo-Indian sites. And that's mostly due to it being a wonderful source of this chert, this raw stone for shaping into projectile points. There's these vast stretches of time for which there's no written record, and we don't know the names of the people that inhabited this place. We don't know their culture or their ethnic identity per se, but we know that they had a particular style of pottery at this time, or a particular style of projectile point at this time.
We consult with a number of federally recognized tribes whose ancestral homelands are in Georgia. All of the tribes who used to live here were removed, and so most of them live in other states, but we do still consult with them because what we're digging up is their history, and they care about it. So we keep them involved in the whole process from the time we decide we're going to build a road or do a project. We notify them that this is something we're intending to do, and then we provide them a chance to let us know if they have concerns or if they know of any cultural significant issues in that area that we should know about, anything sensitive or just that they know of. And then along the way, we provide them copies of all of the reporting from all of the different investigations, from the initial surveys to the data recovery excavations. They'll be getting copies of those reports all along the way, so they have a chance to not only read about their history, but let us know if they have questions, if there are particular things they'd like us to consider or look out for in our investigations.
When we initially identified this site, it was mostly by the presence of tiny little chips of rock that are called flakes, that are the byproduct of making a spear point or a knife. What the layman might call an arrowhead, we call a PPK, which is short for projectile point / knife. They're not natural. You can tell right away they're man-made. They have evidence of being struck. The rock is struck and the flake peels off. And so thousands of flakes litter this area. So in addition to the little chips of stone that we find actual spear points that, because of their shape, how they're stemmed to be hafted to a staff, the size and shapes of the stems are what we call temporally diagnostic. They match with a given cultural period. Stratigraphically, we can determine the age of things by shallower stuff being newer, older stuff being deeper. And so on other sites, it's been established the proper seriation of artifacts, where you know which style dates to which period just by glancing at the artifacts. So typically archaeologists can, once we've recovered a sample of temporally diagnostic artifacts, we can date the assemblage merely by how the artifacts look as compared to other collections on other sites. Those are relative dates. To get absolute dates, we look for items that contain once living carbon, like bone, charcoal. We can take that material, send it off for carbon dating, and figure out how many thousands of years ago they were living here. We know right away from the kinds of artifacts we're finding that this site is a multi-component site that was occupied during numerous different time periods over a broad span of time. The accumulation of artifacts could have been from numerous different periods. We know the inhabitants of the site were coming here to utilize the Brier Creek Chert. That could have been by societies that preferred to live elsewhere and came here just for the chert on a very temporary basis, or it could have been from societies that lived here more permanently. And that's one of the things we're trying to find out, is how the use of the land and this site in particular changed through time.
One of the things I enjoy about archaeology is the mystery of it, that you don't know what you're going to find until you start digging. But I know we had questions about the different time periods represented in this area. I would like to know more about what happened here in the past, but part of our jobs is to conserve and protect those cultural resources, and archaeology is destructive. It's kind of reassuring to know that as big as this site is, there's still a lot that is protected and that won't be impacted by this project or hopefully any project in the future.
We knew going in we'd have a multi-component site, and we knew going in that it was predominantly lithic artifacts, that this area is known as a source of chert. Some people call it flint. Brier Creek is a well-known source of chert, and it's used prehistorically to produce stone tools for hunting, for cutting, for all sorts of things. And people that dwelled in other locations than Brier Creek would often come to Brier Creek just to obtain the chert. And so there's copious amounts of debitage, the flakes and shatter made from making stone tools, clued us into the fact that this site was habitually used as a place to make stone tools. And we wanted to discover more about that process and which periods were most represented.
We received the artifacts in bags, and each bag already has the information for where that artifact was recorded, what level, the date, who recorded it, where it's from within the site. First thing we do is wash the artifacts because they come from the site covered in dirt. Once the artifacts are dry, we'll come to the tables and sort through them. We'll put all the artifacts on a tray and we'll divide them up based on material type.
Every single piece of material that is brought back is cataloged and measured and weighed and observed for any notable attributes that might help the PI during their investigation and with their report. The more formal tools like projectile points have had a lot of bifacial working on both sides and a lot of fine work, so you can see these small flake scars that somebody had taken a lot of time, and it's very different, from just a regular rock. But some of the expedient tools can be harder to tell because they can be more improvisational. So I'll look for maybe something that stands out, like a really sharp edge, and then I'll be checking for additional flake removal, small micro flaking or step fractures that can indicate different types of wear. We'll look at the outline of the edge of the artifact, see the shape of it, look at the cross section of the edge to determine what kind of changes have happened there. We'll look at how pronounced the wear is, if it's light, moderate, or very pronounced. We're seeing a combination of different types of use. Cutting was the most common specific type of use, followed by scraping, which would be expected.
Diagnostic artifacts are artifacts that we can attribute to a certain time period or temporal range, and they can vary depending on the artifact. They're usually based off of previous work that's been done that established these date ranges. We've recovered a LaCroix PPK, and it is diagnostic of early archaic time period. There was also nut fragments, charred wood, a good bit of simple stamped ceramics and cord mark ceramics. We also had diagnostic late archaic Stallings fiber tempered pottery, which was interesting. We found that associated with some fired clay objects. We'll take soil samples that we have from the site, and we'll put it through a series of screens in water.
We'll get out the heavier fractions, the lighter fractions, and it can all be analyzed under a microscope. So any botanical particles, things that are small, more fragile, will be able to be hopefully analyzed and identified, and that could give us more information about what they might have been consuming or preparing or throwing away at the site.
All this information gets stored into the database. All the artifacts get put back into individual bags based on their material type. The information stored in the database allows us to create tables and graphs and search for specific patterns within the assemblage.
We have a QA/QC process where after artifacts are analyzed and entered into the database, we spread them out here on the table, and the PIs will come and look at what the lab has determined the artifacts are and make any sort of corrections in the database that might be necessary.
We've done all of this work, but what are these artifacts telling us in the grand scheme of things and the perspective of, the region, the site location specific to, the water body, Brier Creek in this case.
As I explored the data set, I was overwhelmed by the number of artifacts. There's 60,000 artifacts. As you map it all out in computer software, it just looks like a big blob of a lot of stuff in our excavation unit. And it's a bit daunting to look at that and try to discover patterns in it. But through the careful work of our analysis in the lab, carefully recording differences in material, in artifact size, we're able to discriminate that cloud of data and filter it by specific characteristics that really clue you into unique activities and behaviors in the past.
It makes it more challenging to parse out the little patterns and little details of one particular time period of occupation.
We have numerous lines of evidence indicating what periods the site were occupied, and among these are absolute dates and relative dates, and we could obtain absolute dates using techniques that measure the age of some material precisely. Carbon dating is an absolute dating technique where, based on the radioactive decay of heavy carbon, you can estimate the age at which something died. So once living carbon from bone, from wood, charcoal, shells, these sorts of things can be radiocarbon dated. Another means of absolute dating we employed at the site that was pretty exciting for me was optically stimulated luminescence dating, where you can actually date the grains of quartz themselves. Obviously, the quartz grains are millions of years old, but you can date the age at which they were last exposed to sunlight. Once quartz grains are buried in the ground, they accumulate a charge that just from ambient radiation, and that charge is not released until exposed to sunlight. We hammered these cores into the profile of the unit and obtained sediment that had never been exposed to light. The absolute dates corresponded to what we expected from earlier evidence that the deposits at this site, 9BK 531, are accumulating from the mid-Holocene to the present, which sort of excluded Paleo-Indian deposits because those were early Holocene, and that period of the site's not represented in the sample we excavated. We were able to radiocarbon date some charred nutshell from a layer that also had a lithic concentration in it that dated to about 3,700 BC, about 5,700 years ago, which that dates to the early part of what archaeologists call the late Archaic period. They're still using predominantly stone tools, making large bifaces for projectile points, but the late Archaic is also the period when pottery is invented. That's when the oldest pottery in North America dates to Stallings Island fiber-tempered pottery, which is found in the Savannah River Valley, which Brier Creek is a tributary of the Savannah River. Soapstone's not locally present, but it was imported from the Piedmont, and it was heavily used during the late Archaic period. Fired clay objects, they're sort of mysterious. We don't really know exactly what the fired clay objects are, but they typically date to this period. And so enough of the material culture looks like late Archaic material culture that that's a means of relatively dating the site. The earliest artifacts that we're confident that we know the relative age of is a LaCroix style PPK, which is an early Archaic point style. We have point styles of the Middle Archaic, Brier Creek lanceolate points, Morrow Mountain Point. In the Woodland period, we found Salkehatchie Point that goes with the early Woodland period. In the late Woodland period, we found a late Woodland triangular, which is a tiny triangular shaped projectile point, probably coinciding with the invention of the bow and arrow. So they stopped using extremely large spear points like you'd put on the atlatl dart, and instead started using tinier points that are more reminiscent of a bow and arrow. It's all based on the base of the point, how it's shaped, how it looks. We're referencing material from other sites to be able to apply names to these artifacts and tell their relative ages.
We believe, based on all the data, that the site was primarily used for tool production. So people were coming to this location, they had already gotten their coastal plain chert from somewhere else, and they whittled it down to a size that was suitable for some travel. So they carried it to this location and they made tools here.
Almost all the material we were finding was the smooth interior of the rock and lots of medium-sized flakes and copious numbers of broken bifaces that were on their way to becoming a tool. So this suggests to us that brought to this site were cores that were prepared elsewhere, and those rough cortex was knocked off at the source where they found the rock, and they were brought to this site in that fashion and reduced to large bifaces. And many of these were broken and discarded during manufacture. They weren't used to exhaustion or worn down or resharpened. They were broken as they were being made. There's not a lot of formal projectile points with hafted bases at our site, and that is likely because the bifaces being made at the site were blanks that were taken elsewhere to be finished into final tools and to be used until they were broken or discarded at other sites. We weighed out all the debitage, all the broken bifaces, and did a little math and inferred an estimate that probably several hundred bifaces were made successfully at the site that aren't preserved at the site because they were taken elsewhere, which is really exciting. And going along with that previous discussion about different sorts of materials, we can sort of infer that some of these points were taken away to the Piedmont based on the fact that steatite, quartz, non-local materials are showing up in trace amounts among this collection. the flakes and shatter from stone tool making found at this site were coastal plain chert, which is the local material. But a very small minority was quartz, which is a material that, though present at the site, was found in extremely small amounts. And we know geologically that that material was sourced from somewhere far from the site. When I filtered the data set to just look at the quartz debitage, which was a very small subset of the entire collection, suddenly this cloud of debitage cleared out, and it focused in to these little bullseye patterns within our block. Discrete locations where there were many quartz flakes surrounded by less quartz flakes tapering to nothing. And I can reasonably say with some certainty that 4,000 years ago, someone who came from the Piedmont 80 kilometers away to Brier Creek to obtain coastal plain chert to make tools had brought with them a quartz tool that was made elsewhere, and they paused to sharpen that tool and created a little cloud, and I can say exactly where they were standing when they sharpened that tool, and that tool was not in the archaeological record. They took it with them when they left, but just being able to see with such clarity the actual debitage of a single napping episode come out of all this data was an exciting find.
One of the interesting things that we weren't expecting was to find evidence of paleoliquefaction, which was from a previous earthquake before recorded times that moved the artifacts and did cause some disturbance at the site. But we were surprised to find that it wasn't as extensive as we were initially thinking it was going to be. So we still were able to flesh out a lot of interesting patterns, even though, despite the paleoliquefaction that did happen, you never really think about how an earthquake would affect an archaeology site. So this project highlighted that and, got us thinking about things that we normally wouldn't research. And we reached out to experts in the field and to learn more about paleoliquefaction, because studies have happened outside of this area. So we were able to take some of those previous studies and apply it to this particular region. Having this new perspective with modern archaeological techniques is important.
It was an interesting period, not just in the change of technology, the introduction of pottery, the shellfish economy. It was the beginning of somewhat more sedentary lifestyles. Beginning in the fall, when resources are still plentiful, but spread across the environment. Things like nut mast, the acorns, the hickory shells. These are a plentiful food resource, but they require gathering across large areas. Gearing up for that part of the seasonal cycle, that's when you gotta repair your toolkit. You gotta make the projectile points you're gonna use to hunt game during the winter when there's no other sources of food. So there's actually a pattern of these locus of toolkit renewal, and it forms a part of the settlement system that suggests a seasonal pattern where they're moving from their spring and summer encampments to more farther flung hinterland, perhaps breaking it down into individual family units as opposed to big communities. So it might be that at a site like ours, we're finding that gearing up phase of producing the bifaces that you need to have the toolkit to get through the winter to come. All these factors come together to suggest that there's a broader seasonal pattern of site use and occupation that's fleshed out more by exploring not just the shell middens with spectacular preservation, but also these lithic sites like ours.
We were able to really fit this site into the larger settlement of the region in Georgia, the Savannah River Valley.
Through this careful archaeology, we're able to come up with excellent data that helps us understand things like the subsistence patterns and the economy of ancient people and the origins of settled society versus hunter-gatherers, you know, the beginnings of agriculture, the beginnings of pottery. All these things are represented in Georgia's rich archaeological heritage. It's key to point out that it does take a lot of detailed work to extract that information, and that information can be lost when developers are building things, but it can also be lost when amateurs are out there just looking for the points and digging big looter holes across sites and only finding what they think are the cool artifacts. Even just from the simple debitage, we're able to infer the tools that were created that are no longer present at the site. So things that might be dismissed by somebody that's only interested in the cool whiz-bang, really attractive artifacts, you need to realize that all of the archaeological deposits have information value, and that is our shared heritage. We shouldn't be so cavalier about its loss and destruction. This entire exercise in doing a phase 3 data recovery, it just really points to how agencies and consultants can work together with tribes and State Historic Preservation Office and interested community members to really get to the nuts and bolts of what matters about this site and how it can be discovered and protected and understood for the future benefit of us all.